Joining me now is Dan McClory. He's the managing director of Boustead Securities, as well as the head of equity markets and head of the China desk. Dan, good to have you back on the show with us. Dan, let's just first react to this development regarding Huawei. Do you think that the U.S. is exaggerating the threat of Huawei?
Well, if you listen to the Europeans, you would say yes. If you listen to some of our other allies, you would say no. So it's somewhat divided. And I think it really has to do with the level of penetration, whether you're talking about routers and switches or handheld devices, but really the whole 5G apparatus that's coming into play. So there are a large school of thought that says this is not an instrument of the Chinese government, Huawei, because it was supposedly born out of the PLA or whatever. There's a lot to put that aside. But I think the reality of signing all these agreements in Europe with Huawei is that, there are many other countries that are seeing clear to doing business with that company.
And that is just another issue that puts the U.S. at odds with some of its allies, and another point of contention between the U.S. and China. Of course, big focus on these trade talks that are scheduled to resume. The president saying that he's ready to impose higher tariffs, to increase them up to 25% on around $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. China says it will retaliate if the U.S. does this. What are the ways that China could retaliate?
Well, of course, U.S. exports into China. So you've seen things such as heavy equipment manufacturers. We always talk about John Deere tractors and things of that nature. That's one immediate area that you would look at. Also electronics, because remember, there's a whole part of the value chain of products that are coming into the U.S. that go back out of the U.S. So if you look at other areas like our agricultural exports, which has been an attempt to get at President Trump's base, farmers in Iowa and things like that, that's another one that comes to mind, with soya being impacted and China kind of turning to Brazil and other sources for that particular commodity. But there aren't a whole lot of cards on China's side of the table right now to be played.
Right, because in terms of slapping tariffs, the Chinese have practically run out of goods that they can slap tariffs on, considering there is that big trade imbalance. Do you see China perhaps using some geopolitical developments to its advantage during these negotiations? For example, saying that they'll continue to import oil from Iran, although they have been saying that so far. Do you see them using that as a bargaining chip? Do you see them perhaps bringing in the issue of denuclearization of North Korea, bringing in those issues to these trade talks?
Michelle, those are two great points. And it just shows how you look at things holistically. And it's not as simple as economics, because those are really two important pieces on the chessboard that frankly, have outsized importance to these economic considerations. I'd be very surprised if they didn't. Of course, they're not going to show up in that 150-page document with 7 chapters in English that need to be translated into Chinese and everything else. But you better believe they're in the back of people's minds, and those are two really, really strong pieces of leverage that have to be factored into the overall equation.
Dan, we know that the Chinese edited whatever was agreed on before this meeting. What do you think is going to happen tomorrow? Do you think there'll be some progress made?
I honestly think this trade deal gets pushed into 2020. I think they're going to show up for appearances, both sides. We have a saying, and in our investment banking business, we're signing deals with Chinese companies every day. We say in China, an agreement is just a pause between negotiations. So this is not unusual. Even if they get to the point of believing they've agreed, there's always one more thing. And it's not just from the Chinese side. So I don't think it's going to result, Friday's meetings will result in anything substantive. Of course, these new tariffs are going to kick in. That's going to exacerbate the problem even further. And you have two very strong leaders. And, we've given China a very narrow window with some huge concessions that are still being asked for. And it's really tough to see how all that gets squeezed into the next 24 to 36 hours.
A lot of issues to tackle. Dan, thanks for breaking it down with us. Dan McClory, appreciate it.